Hi guys, it's Catherine. So in this video I'm going to be talking about some books that are either written by Icelandic authors or that are set in Iceland. I mentioned in my last video that I want to start a series where in each video I talk about a set of books that I want to recommend from a specific country, and Iceland was really the first one that jumped into my mind. I think Iceland produces such great art, whether it be music or literature or even films, and there's just so much to choose from considering they only have 300,000 people living there. They really produce such great stuff, so I have 6 books to talk to you about today. I'm going to start with 3 that are written by Icelandic authors and translated, and then 3 that are set in Iceland, at least partly. And I think when you think of Icelandic fiction, you often think of crime fiction, and that's unsurprising. Although they have a really low rate of violent crime in the country, the atmospheric, kind of desolate atmosphere really lends itself well to crime. And I only have actually one crime book to recommend to you because crime's not really my thing. And actually the author that I've chosen is not the most famous Icelandic crime author, who is Ursa Sigurðardóttir, but I've actually chosen Ragnar Jónasson. So here it is. It's called The Darkness. It looks like such a typical crime novel. And if you enjoy The Bridge, which is like a Scandinavian TV crime series who has a female detective called Sigga in it, I think you'll like this because similarly it also has a quite complex female detective as the protagonist. I really don't feel like an authority on what makes crime fiction good because I really read so little of it, but I really enjoyed this one. I felt like it was a pacey thriller. It really drew me in and it was twisty throughout, but it also did have a slightly more complex side to it where you slowly find out more about the protagonist's backstory as you progress, and I think the detective in this book is going to be the main character in his future books as well. So she's about to be forced into retirement when she gets an opportunity to revitalise her career with a cold case. So it was the body of a Russian woman washed up onto the shores of Iceland, and it was initially ruled a suicide, but she thinks there's something more to it. I felt like it was a twisty and unpredictable crime novel, which is what you always want, but it did also touch on more serious themes like immigration and prostitution, and also the treatment of women in the workplace. I think if you like crime, this is a really good one, but equally if you're someone like me and it's not really always your thing, I think it has enough elements from other genres to make it compelling itself as well. Next is something very different, and it's a very short novella called The Blue Fox by Sjón. And this one was really interesting to me because it combines quite otherworldly, ethereal subject matter with also very serious and quite earthy themes, and it includes a character with Down syndrome, for example. I really don't want to talk about the plot much because it's seriously only 100 pages and I don't want to spoil anything, but it interweaves the story of a priest who's hunting a rare blue fox with other characters from his town, and it also includes passages from earlier in time where there was a shipwreck off the coast of Iceland. I think this book is much less about the plot than the writing itself though, and I felt like probably out of all of the books that I've chosen, this one captures most that kind of sparsity of the Icelandic language and the setting itself as well, and it's very beautifully written. It really juxtaposes the potential beauty and also the hostility of the landscape, and you can say that of probably most of the books here as well. That's quite typical of Iceland, but it's the way that this is written and definitely the way that it's been translated as well that is really to its merit. Also, I just realised that both of these books were actually translated by the same person, Victoria Cribb, and I want to give her some credit for this because I think she's done a really great job with both of them. The last of the translated books I want to recommend is Hotel Silence by Auður Ólafsdóttir, and you might know her other book slightly better, which is called Butterflies in November, which came out a few years ago, although this one was just published earlier this year. Hotel Silence is a bit different as well because although it does have a very Icelandic flavour, a lot of it is not actually set in Iceland. So it follows a man who is feeling very hopeless about his life. Everything has kind of crumbled around him and he's really seeing no reason to continue living. And he decides to go on an impromptu trip to a war-torn country and stay in an almost abandoned hotel to try and make sense of his situation and find some meaning in his life again. It's quite a charming book, and I often don't like that because sometimes they're too twee or overly unrealistic, but I think this one actually did that well because although it did have those elements of hope, it still dealt with really serious topics very sensitively. I'm definitely keen to read her other book now, so if you've read that one, let me know, because I'd like to hear what you thought. So on to the 3 books that are set in Iceland, and I tried to choose ones that I thought were very well researched and as authentic as they could be, considering they're not by Icelandic authors. And the first one is actually non-fiction. It's a memoir of sorts by Sarah Moss, who you might know as the author of The Tidal Zone, and it's about her year that she spent teaching at the university in Iceland. It's not travel writing as such, because she doesn't talk about the kind of natural beauty or the wonders that she goes to see in Iceland. It's much more focused on her time in Reykjavik, where she does spend the majority of that year, and discussing the elements of culture and language and the attitudes of Icelandic people. It's from the perspective of an Englishwoman, so a lot of it is comparing the differences in culture between England and Iceland, and it also delves into the kind of politics and current affairs of that time. It was written 10 years ago, so it was quite a tumultuous time for Iceland, because they were dealing with their big banker scandal then, and also the huge travel disruption across Europe caused by one of their big volcanoes. I really enjoyed this book because it wasn't romanticised a lot. I think Moss really did well in tackling the tougher subjects and being critical where she thought it was necessary. One part that I thought was really interesting was that she talked about gender equality in Iceland, which is generally seen to be the best in the world. They have high levels of equality in the workplace, and their legal rights are very fair towards women. But there are obviously still issues of sexism, especially in the home. There's quite high levels of domestic abuse, it doesn't really fit in with the wholesome image of Iceland, so it's often brushed under the carpet, but it certainly is an issue that ought to be discussed. Moss also researches the attitudes towards immigration in Iceland, and although they pride themselves on their welcoming attitude and their openness, they also have very strong traditions that they want to protect, whatever means necessary, and of course that is sometimes at odds with its attitudes towards immigration. It was definitely something that came up again and again, is that Iceland are very keen to protect the sanctity of their traditions, and sometimes this works against their progressive outlook. And in a lot of cases it's not harmful at all, it just means that they have quite strange and seemingly outdated practices. Moss clearly did really enjoy her time in Iceland. She talks a lot about how friendly people were to her and how they would do anything to accommodate her, and also the attitudes towards safety in the country, which are so different to in the UK anyway. Iceland is just such a safe place that people act completely differently around children and their property. It's just super interesting. I don't really like reading memoirs because I'm rarely interested enough in the person themselves to read a whole book about them, but this book is definitely much more about Iceland and the culture and the experiences there rather than her herself. And it also is written much more like fiction, so the prose is really flowing, and if you like her writing style, which I really did in The Tidal Zone, then I think you would enjoy this. The next book is actually the reason I wanted to make this video in the first place. I loved it so much, it's one of my favourite books so far this year, and it made me just want to read so many more books about Iceland, and it's called The Sealwoman's Gift by Sally Magnusson, who is a Scottish writer of Icelandic heritage. I found it so beautifully written, and if you're Scottish or if you've watched Scottish TV, you will probably recognise Sally Magnusson as a TV news presenter, and for that reason I definitely wrongly thought that it would be quite clinical in the way it was written, and certainly not as emotional as I found it to be. It's based on a true story set on an island just off the coast of Iceland, which was raided in 1627 by Barbary pirates, and many of its occupants were sold into slavery in Algiers. This book specifically follows one family who are torn apart by this event, where the wife Ásta and her children are taken, and they have to learn to live in a completely different culture away from the rest of their family, while those who are left behind have to deal with living without them, and also the guilt that they were taken and they weren't. This is such a good story. I found it so well plotted and just really heartbreaking. It also incorporates elements of traditional Icelandic sagas, and in doing so it questions the sort of relationship between storytelling and truth, which is a theme that I really enjoyed throughout. It's brilliantly done. It surpassed all of my expectations by a million miles, and I couldn't recommend it enough. So the last book I have to recommend to you is Burial Rites by Hannah Kent. This one's also based on a real historical event in Iceland, when in 1829 a young woman in the north of Iceland was sentenced to death accused of murder. This book's definitely drawn comparisons with Margaret Atwood's Alias Grace because they both explore female guilt and the potential subjectivity of truth and the varying interpretations of events. I don't want to say too much about this book because, of course, a book like this is very easy to spoil, but I think the beauty of it is not actually in the plot itself but in the writing, and especially the descriptions of the landscapes, which in northern Iceland especially are particularly desolate. It's a deeply psychological novel that really draws you in and it gets you thinking and questioning your own beliefs. But it's not a crime thriller type book like The Darkness. This is much more of a slow burner. So those are all the books that I wanted to talk about today. Let me know if you have any other recommendations of books set in Iceland because I really want to read more now. I think the next video I might do in this series will be on Japanese books because I'm really interested in those and I've already read quite a lot. I just think this is a really fun idea because it gets me reading more books in translation and gets me learning about other cultures. So I hope you enjoyed this video and I will see you very soon in my next one. Okay, bye bye!